Good morning and welcome to inaugural Block Sport podcast, where we'll be talking to executives from the sports industry, media, entertainment coming weeks and months. My name is Samir Seric. I'm the podcast host, and today with me is Berisha, the founder of Sporting Crypto, number one sports web3 newsletter. Great to have you with me, Pat, today. I've been following your rise to the top of the industry in the crypto and Web3 space for a long time now. And obviously, your newsletter, Sporting Crypto, is pretty much read by the great and good of the sports industry on both sides of the ocean and globally too. I'm sure the audience would love to hear more about your own background. First, what led to this career choice before we delve into the topics the industry is either struggling with or still unsure about?
Sure. So I stumbled into the Web3 world in 2017. I joined a boutique financial consultancy whose go-to-market strategy was heavily leveraging media, mainly podcasts. And one of those podcasts was about blockchain, called Blockchain Insider, that I was lucky enough to produce or lead the production of from mid 2017 to mid 2020. And we were very well listened to. We were one of the biggest crypto podcasts at the time, even when the industry was quite small. And we had a lot of traction. We did live shows globally in Vegas, Amsterdam, London, etc. And we're very well followed, I think. And that kind of grew my network mainly in London, but also around the world within the kind of crypto sphere specifically. And it was just a really, really fascinating time. I mean, the content we were looking at was mostly to do with how blockchain was going to impact financial services, which was interesting, but maybe not captivating to me. And I remember we saw the kind of first NFTs out in the world in the crypto kitties in 2018. And that was weird, but quite interesting. And then obviously saw So Rare and Top Shot and a lot of other more culturally relevant crypto related products and games and propositions that interested me a lot more. And I think in mid 2020 when I'd left that business, I'd accumulated a big network, a specific skill set and knowledge in a space that was kind of growing very quickly. And I've always been very passionate in sport, big fan of sports, played a lot when I was younger, big sport fan in general. And when I got the opportunity to join Copper 90 as their head of crypto media on kind of a 2 day a week contract, it was kind of the industry, or at least the sports agency industry's first hire in that kind of world. And I think it made quite a lot of headlines, way more than I anticipated. I didn't think it was very much a big deal. But at that point, I got to peer behind the sports business curtain firsthand. And I realized how big a gap there was in the understanding of what this world actually was and how it worked and where the pitfalls were and where the opportunities were. And I thought that they were going down a path that I didn't expect, but in retrospect, one that was really inevitable. Um, and 2 or 3 months later, at that point, I was having maybe 30 calls a week, mostly inbound, from people globally trying to do really, really ambitious things, crazy things, things that I thought weren't going to work. So anything from someone in Oceania trying to buy a football club in the UK using a DAO to a huge rights holder considering a big sponsorship offer from a crypto exchange. And again, double down on the realization that no, not that many people knew what was going on, not that many people knew what they were doing. The plane was being flown as it was being built, the playbook was being written as the plays were being played, and that made me think it was worrying but also exciting in the sense that there was an opportunity to do something here a little bit different. And I'd never done any kind of B2B content before apart from Blockchain Insider, the podcast that I produced. And so I just started writing down my thoughts, started creating and formulating my own opinions and thesis on this space via a newsletter. And I didn't really think much of it, or many people would read it. But between September 21 and when we launched to the end of the year, we had about 400 subscribers. By the start of Q2 22, we had 1,000. By the end of 22, we had 2,000. By the end of 23, we had 3,000. We're now at 3,250 subscribers, and we're lucky enough to be read and digested by a lot of the most respectable and notable decision makers in sport, but also Web3. And our last 1,000 subscribers have also skewed towards gaming, big tech, also brands that have a vested interest in sports. So if you think of some of the biggest sports sponsors in retail, in e-commerce, in food and drink, in manufacturing, those are all also reading the content, which is great. We launched a podcast about half a year ago, which is 12 episodes old now. Will be 13 next Thursday, where we're doing a season of interviewing some of the most respected Web3 and sports leaders. We also do events globally, so that's the third part of our kind of media offering. And then I've also done a lot of, or been lucky enough to do a lot of advisory and consultancy work, whether that's a sports rights holder or a Web3 startup that are looking to get into sport or looking to get into the kind of brand side of things and looking for some advice. And yeah, so that's been the journey of the last 2.5 years, and been lucky enough to continue growing, whether the market's been down or up. And that's been a good USP, I guess.
Fantastic. I'm very highly impressed with the journey, and I think this is in my conversations with various sporting properties around the world in different sports, whether it's the clubs, leagues, and federations. I've been maintaining my view that the younger generation, and you kind of represent the younger generation when it comes down to the Web3 and the sports industry in general, understands the power of blockchain and what it can do when it comes down to the engagement, as well as the sort of new revenue opportunities. And you mentioned the fact that there's now bigger and bigger brands, and I agree with you that they are looking for a different way of leveraging their brand exposure, especially when they're behind, in some instances, up to 95% of the sporting property annual budget. So when you are technically funding the sort of life and death of a sporting property, you also want to get some return on that investment. Although as a former chairman of the football club, I always maintain the position that sporting properties are more like social enterprises. Many sports tech players come in and want to sort of leverage and exploit the fan bases. And as you and I both know, some clubs have got millions and tens of millions of fans, and the tech companies are coming in and looking them as a customers and consumers, which to a point is true. But when I was a chairman of the football club, the club turned 100, and I end up talking about the next 100 years of the football club, being told as the only club chairman that talks about 100-year vision rather than 10-year vision. But it was purely because I said to the fans, people like me, chairman, club owners, come and go. Whether we stay for 5, 10, 15 years, the club will be around in the next 100 years. So we have to redefine the kind of pyramid within the sports industry, where, in my view, fans go on top of the pyramid, the club operators and owners in the middle, and technology partners, advisors, as a sort of facilitators at the bottom, in order to help connect the dots. You mentioned an interesting thing, and I saw in your last LinkedIn post also a bit more on NFT and pricing. And I read a great deal about the death of NFTs, and I think 6 to 12 months ago, people were even more aggressive when it comes down to NFTs, purely because of so many bad examples. But what's your view on NFTs? Why do you feel the blockchain technology is much bigger than a Panini card types of NFTs? As somebody who's passionate about blockchain, I do lots of guest lecturing. I've started a PhD in blockchain, and I talk about the importance of the blockchain's technology and three T's: trust, transparency, and traceability, in order to kind of maybe educate the audience out there, but at the same time tell them that crypto and Bitcoin is not blockchain, NFT is not blockchain. These are just the components inside the blockchain sort of technology. So I'd love to hear your views on it, where it's going, and maybe you can touch on the pricing side of the NFTs and how, in your view, should be done, very much similar to what you posted on LinkedIn recently.
Sure. So I think taking a 200-foot view first, I think people really overcomplicate the value proposition of a blockchain, right? And what I mean by that is blockchain technology is the best technology humans have created to date to own things online, right? Very simply put, before blockchain, we could not own anything online, and now we can. And I think that right now, this doesn't feel that important to the average consumer. But I think that in 5, 10, 15 years, it will be more and more so as we become more digitally native, even though we already are very much so, spending countless hours on phones and digital devices per hour. But I saw a Ubisoft exec today or overnight said gamers need to get used to not owning games, which is really interesting. You've also seen the Apple and Epic lawsuit around having to have payments within the Apple App Store, which a lot of developers think is unfair. Apple have said that's fine, but if you want to have transactions outside the App Store, here's 9 rules that you have to abide by. And one of those rules, by the way, is that we can audit you if we want. And so there is a huge centralization of power happening right now in the digital world, and it's being owned by very, very few entities, which is not the same for anything in the real world, right? Like there is not one or like 10 entities that own all land, manufacturing, farming, whatever it may be globally. But for some reason in the digital realm, that's kind of what's happened. And so I do think that maybe blockchain won't be the holy grail and answer all these questions and concerns that we have. But at the very least, this blockchain technology puts pressure on those big organizations digitally to loosen their ties and stranglehold on this kind of digital world. Then I think it's done quite well. I think that might be the worst case scenario. And now zooming in more specifically to NFTs, again, as you mentioned, these are just a component, a thing that can be built on blockchain, and it is a mechanism for people to own things online. That's it. And now I think that when you look at licensing, right, whether it's from sports, from movies, whatever it may be, we are in the same kind of era that we were in like the 80s and 90s, where brands license their game development rights, or movies license their game development rights. And I'm too young to remember this, obviously, Samir, but you may remember. A lot of these games were really bad because they handed off the rights to game developers who made games with the simple prerequisite of making revenue, and nothing else mattered. Um, but as the years went on, games like Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, sports games started to get better and better and better, to the point that now licensed games are some of the biggest in the world. And those take a lot of investment. They take a lot of cooperation and engagement from partners. If you think about how FIFA engages their licensees and vice versa, those are huge, huge deals that make money, but require a lot of effort from both sides. And I think there is elements to that, and elements to how sports teams and football teams have engaged in social media, which kind of point to the future of where this space is heading. I strongly believe that football teams will have to invest in this technology rather than look at it as a revenue driver in the short term, for sure. especially when it comes to direct revenue. I think that they should be investing in this to engage an audience, learn more about their audience, and learn more about their audience's habits and what they actually want. If we look at what McLaren Racing have done, where they had over 3 million NFT claims throughout 2023 from over 600,000 unique individuals, almost 5,000 of those people collected every single NFT from every single race. Those numbers aren't small, right? Those numbers aren't people just speculating and hoping they can make money, because no one would go to those lengths to make 10, 15, 20 pounds, whatever it may be. These are people that are actually engaged and want to be part of that community. They have over 40,000 Discord members that are really well engaged. And so I think we've seen green shoots and seen examples where this can work and be really engaging and create communities that are really, really valuable for sports IP. But broadly speaking, I think we've seen approaches of a vendor goes to a sports team, says, we will leverage your rights, and this is how much we will sell these rights for on the blockchain. And this is how much money you expect to make. And now some of that pricing might not be so bad, but when you think of oh, well, if we want to make this margin as the vendor, we need to up the price to this, you start plugging numbers in on a spreadsheet, and all of a sudden you're pricing these digital assets at $70, $100, $200, $300. And for what? A digital piece of memorabilia that may or may not yield some value in the future, that may or may not have some utility that is pre-agreed upon. I just don't think the economics and the incentive structures stack up. And I think people are finding that out. And I still see deals done and announcements made now where everything looks fine, but then you look at the pricing model and it's just completely off the mark with a cost of living crisis, the broader economy, the amount of money fans have to spend on going to games and viewing games and so on and so forth. It lacks self-awareness, but I think that self-awareness in part is driven by the fact that a vendor and a rights holder and a blockchain underneath it need to make some sort of margin if they're to do these things. But I think that needs to be flipped on its head. I think the teams need to think of this as an engagement mechanism. Teams don't make money from social media. They use it as an engagement channel, and they should be looking at this in the same lens that they do that. I think when you think about licensing, for example, there needs to be a more collaborative push, more collaborative programs in the same sense that we've seen from EA and their rights holders that they have agreements with. So there's a mix of those two stories that I think we can take some inspiration from, and hopefully there will be some better propositions in the coming decade.
I think you made two very, very strong and valid points, Beth, in the sense that, when talking to various sporting property owners and management, there's still that notion that they expect to be paid for the opportunity to do two important things, which is deepen their fan engagement, because they need to. The days of just selling your merchandise and tickets and doing the sponsorship deals for most sporting properties, big or small, around the world, is the thing of the past. And number two, I think they overvalue their brand IP in the sense that they expect a check written, which sadly has been done over the past 2 or 3 years with some of the players, but hasn't boded well for anyone, either the sporting properties or those players either, because all these promised returns have not materialized in the end. But I think we have a fundamental issue on the educational side of the equation when it comes down to explaining to those in charge of the sporting properties, clubs, leagues, federations, that data is king. As you mentioned, they don't make any money on social media because they give this content and sort of data points free of charge to the big boys, but they are not keen to build their own digital infrastructure where they can have a direct communication channel to their fans. Or, as you said, their fans freebies, because why should you charge your fans? They're already spending, as you said, hundreds and thousands of dollars in the global economic recession, things sort of to spend more money on, instead of engaging them more, because loyalty is no longer a given thing. Maybe, I used to go to football matches with my grandfather and father. We had season tickets, from the age of 6 months. Obviously, I didn't remember much at that time, or 2 years, because I was all into eating rather than consuming the content on the pitch. But I'm seeing the kids, of my own kids, age 11, 13, and their generation of not being so loyal to the clubs that they were perhaps born into, and they now seem to be a lot more fickle. And then when we go to other parts of the world, like Asia and Africa, there's even less loyalty than it is in the UK and across Europe. And I think the element and the struggle the industry currently has is the need, as you said, to invest medium to long term rather than having expectations short term. And I was going to bring up McLaren use case. I think it's a very positive one, because they didn't charge their fans, so they're now super fans that collected every single one of the NFTs of 23 season. That's a great example. But I think we have a lot of work to do in the space of really driving the message that data is king, and the sponsors and the main partners of these sporting properties are actually expecting a lot more from the clubs, leagues, federations they're spending millions on, and sort of want some sort of leverage, some sort of return. So I hope that in my own view on NFTs as a digital collectibles, they've been around for a long time. I've been collecting art for decades. There's a huge parallel between limited edition print versus the original. There is now more and more sort of joining forces between physical and digital, and NFT as the sort of unique. I remember my 11-year-old was doing some 11 plus and 13 plus exams recently. So he said that I collect match attacks, and I'd like to turn them into NFTs because I want to keep my originals. I want to sell the NFTs, and I want to sort of really promote my own collection online, but I don't want to lose the original side of the equation. So, the young generation is really consuming it in a different way. And I want to move on to the next thing, which is Gen Z and Gen Alpha fandom. And, what do you think the sporting properties out there, as well as brands, but let's focus on sport, need to do to attract as well as maintain the true fans in the future? Because I think the millennials and pre-millennials have got still the old school way of thinking of loyalty and the relationship with their clubs. But the new generation, as we just mentioned, that is a lot more fickle. What would your advice be for the next 5, 10, 15 years that those making decisions now for the future in the space should do?
It's a really interesting query. I think if you look at it at the backdrop of what we're seeing with broadcast rights in sport, but specifically football, I think there's been a real struggle from France and Italy. I don't know much about the La Liga side of the broadcast rights. I know that the Premier League just renewed with Sky and BT at a slightly bigger deal, but giving away more matches. So we seem to have plateaued in England in terms of revenue for broadcast rights. And Amazon didn't feel it was worth kind of pushing the boat out that far for those rights. I'm sure they'll be involved in the future rounds for sure. It's very interesting, right? Because like broadcast and match day revenue are like the strongest revenue drivers that football teams have, and they are starting to plateau or cap, right? Like how much more can tickets go for, right? It's now £100 to go watch Arsenal against Porto in the Champions League last 16. It's a lot of money, right? I do think broadly speaking, the value of going to a football game is not terrible compared to like going to the cinema or the theater, for example. If you think about it in totality, but this is supposed to be a working class sport. You know, it's never been seen as a high end premium sport like tennis, for example, or golf. This is supposed to be accessible to anyone, and it's fast becoming not so. And I think that teams are starting to try and balance that in stadium relationship building with out of stadium relationship building. But right now, the only way they've done that so far is through membership and social media. And I think we'd be shocked. Well, maybe we wouldn't, but most people would be shocked how little data that these teams have on those fans. We obviously saw the Spotify and Barcelona story where Barcelona said we have 300 million fans, but they had data on 3 million of them. How does that happen? Right? Who's made the mistakes there that Barcelona don't have information on those 300 million fans, enough information that they can impress sponsors? That's a huge gap to make up. 297 million fans. Is that because Barcelona only have 3 million emails in their database? Or is it because they can't get enough data on the 500 million social followers they have? And so something needs to bridge that in between. And I think there'll be some very good Web2 solutions that help that kind of tracking and data portability. But obviously, when you have specific GDPR rules, what we've seen with cookies and analytics, some kind of more legislative blockers have stopped some of these teams getting enough granular data on these people, on these fans. And so I think Web3 can be a solution for some of that gap that we're talking about. And I don't know if it's the holy grail and it's the true answer, and people are talking about NFTs and tokens being like cookies. But I do wonder if legislation at some point, from a privacy perspective, starts to stretch to wallets and tokens, and I don't know what impact that will have in the long term. But short term, I do think the amount of data you can get or understanding of a fan or consumer you can get from digital activations using Web3 Rails can be a lot greater than what we're seeing with simple membership schemes. And I'd push that to say, like, a lot of the membership schemes we've seen in sport are really bad. These are the most loyal people to any brand. Like, you look at the Starbucks app and how many 50 million users it has, and it has more cash on it than most banks. People aren't as loyal to coffee as they are to sports teams. So who has missed a trick there to create a Real Madrid or a Barcelona or a Arsenal or a Chelsea or a Manchester City loyalty app that has genuinely got or tens of millions of users that those teams can then leverage in their sponsorship activations, rather than just brand equity and kind of vanity metrics? You can actually say we can leverage 30 million people at the click of a button. And for example, McLaren can now say that they have 650,000 people on chain, and they can say we can leverage that network whenever we want. Maybe not in a paid way, but in an interactive engagement way. And I don't know if many teams and sports rights holders can do the same, which is easy to think about.
And I think very interesting point, which I've been discussing, and also before we started the session, we talked about how the big players, the big sponsors, are now applying pressure on those that they're sponsoring exactly to do that, because I don't think if we gave them the freedom of choice, they would follow that, because perhaps running day-to-day operations of a football club or basketball club or rugby club doesn't teach you the things that you need to really understand when it comes down to fan engagement, which my view is that this younger generation that consumes the content in a different way and is used to Web3 should really be brought at the forefront of these, call it now, the Web3 or metaverse divisions that some of the big properties are starting to introduce. I think it's still a bit of a faff in my view, but I'd like to think that inevitably it is the present and the future. It might take a little bit of time, and that was going to be my next question when it comes down to the value of Web3 projects provided to these clubs, the club owners, and their respective fans. In your kind of view, what is the realistic time frame for that Web3 adoption that these top sports competitions, the clubs, events across different sports cultures and continents should expect? Because I think managing expectation, both in terms of the results and as well as the adoption, has been an issue in the past.
To be honest with you, uh, it's difficult to say, right? Some teams have unfair advantages, whether it's resources or brand or they're new, right? Like, so I wrote a piece on LAFC and how they're building a digital program from the ground up and they're incorporating Web3. This is a lot easier to do when your team is 15 years old rather than 150, right? um, and so there's that aspect of it. Um, I think there are certain cultural inhibitors when it comes to football compared to, say, the NBA, and in the same way that there is cultural inhibitors in the in MLB and NFL. And NHL compared to NBA, and there are organizational and governance structures that stop specific things happening. Um, for those more progressive and newer brands, newer teams, and newer leagues, I can see this happening really quickly, like over the next 3 to 5 years. Um, for those that are older and have slightly more legacy infrastructure or rights deals that they are involved in, embroiled in, that they can't get out of, um, perhaps that this is a more longer term thing. Um, but yeah, I said 3 to 5 years. I think that's a long time in any tech cycle. But I think within 7 years, most sports teams, football teams, whatever it may be, will have some sort of blockchain incorporation, whether it's like from a logistical perspective, authentication perspective, ticketing perspective, or whether it's from a engagement perspective. I think it's kind of inevitable at this point.
Sure. Excellent. So, um, very much in line with what we hear and see a great deal is 2030 vision. And I'll touch on that. But before I ask you on that vision, I saw that you recently in New York. Um, Wants to know what made you go to New York and how different is kind of New York crypto Web3 scene to so London. And then what was your highlight being there and doing an event?
Yeah, so I mean, I think culturally speaking, there is a lot more appetite to spend, to um, engage, to make things happen. I think it is a lot more fast paced. There is, even though the legislation in the States and New York is a lot more inhibiting than Europe and the UK, um, I think there is a lot more appetite and hunger to be on the front foot. Whereas I think Europe and the UK is waiting for it to come to them. I don't think either way is wrong. Like, I don't think there is a huge advantage to being a first mover in this space, I must say. Um, that being said, maybe that my mind will change if we see Nike and Starbucks have done amazing things in 3 years, and someone like Arsenal is just starting their journey, for example. Um, I I think, broadly speaking, in New York, there is just a greater appetite to get things done, to move at pace, to invest, to um, engage stakeholders in truly understanding what this is. Obviously, there are still big regulatory concerns, but I do think with the kind of ETF approval, those are clearing up slightly. Um, those are broadly the cultural differences that I'm seeing.
And would you say it's not just New York, but it's US in general, i.e., LA, Miami, San Fran, or would you say it's obviously New York as a financial district with some major sporting properties out of there is kind of still forging ahead of the rest of the United States?
I think there's interest from a lot of the states, right? I think that those hubs that you mentioned, Austin's become a big place as well. I know Toronto and Vancouver as well in North America are quite big and hot on Web3. LA has a really big Web3 hub, as you mentioned. So I think the States broadly has got that, caught the bug, and also just has a lot more enthusiasm and excitement compared to most of Europe. But, there are pockets of Europe, what the government are trying to do in London and the UK now, trying to make the country a crypto hub. Whether or not that will work, I'm kind of skeptical. But Berlin, Paris, Lisbon, we've seen a lot of these countries really push, these cities rather, push that kind of crypto hub mentality within Europe. So not all hope is lost here. I do think Europeans move a bit slower, but maybe slow and steady will win the race, eh?
Exactly, and I think there's that kind of culture and heritage of Europe versus the new world is kind of plays to the sort of mindset and psychology of our nations in Europe. Great. So I'd like to start rounding up by just finding out a bit more about what's next for PET, what your predictions for 24 hour, as well as medium to long term. I mentioned early on, everyone talks about this 2030 vision. We've also seen it recently with the Saudi government and their league, and the fact that they're behind 2034 World Cup and all sorts of things that's being built over there in that MENA region is very different to what we saw 5 to 10 years ago. There's talks whether they're going to learn from the China mistake when they tried to bring some big players 20 years ago and paid huge bucks, but it didn't really stick. So, in short, what's next for you, your views for 24 and beyond, and in general, sort of the sort of feeling of, what's out there?
I think 24 is going to be a consolidatory year to some extent. I think a lot of Web3 companies have been trying to stay afloat. A lot of these propositions have been trying to survive. And I think this year will be a year where they try to grow. Some of the smaller ones try to grow. But I do think there is going to be a shift from the revenue driving sponsorship angle that we've seen over the next kind of 18 to 24 months. You mentioned the MENA region. Obviously, there's a lot of interest there in sport. You mentioned whether or not it could last, like China. From what I'm hearing, the people that are engaging and operating with the players in the MENA region, they say that they are deadly serious. And I think there is this attitude from the West that it's just throwing money around with no plan. From what I'm hearing anyway, from all the stakeholders in sport in Europe, the UK, the US that are speaking to the MENA region, the people there are deadly serious about like really owning a portion, if not all, of sport. And so I think it's something we should be prepared for. I think it's something that also yields an opportunity, because if you are able to have bigger influence from the ground up in some of these greenfield leagues or leagues that are younger, you can have a lot more technological change a lot quicker. I think this also is true for new leagues and new sports. We've seen pickleball, paddle, the Kings League, and so on and so forth just explode over the last 3 years. Some of that driven by lockdown and the pandemic, but I don't know. I just think that there is going to be more and more of this, where sport in 15 years might look very different than what it does now. I remember seeing, was it the Sidemen, the influencers, do a charity game on YouTube that got more views than than most Premier League teams to get. There are a lot of like influencer-led Sunday league teams that sell more jerseys than most championship teams in the UK. And so I think the landscape of what an athlete looks like could change a lot in 20 years, right? We don't know where it's going to go. I'm not saying that people are going to tune in to watch influencer soccer every Sunday. Far from it. But I do think that new models and new leagues, new teams could have big opportunities in accruing large audiences, and that could be pushed through digital means for sure, or at least kept through digital means and engaged longer term through digital means. But yeah, let's see how that goes.
Fantastic. Very, very interesting. And I think I'm with you on the emergence of new leagues and huge amounts of investment that's gone in also from, former athletes and current athletes. I think we're seeing in that sort of sports tech investment circle that, the likes of some of the NBA players have made more money in investing in successful, sports tech sort of ecosystem than they made during the sort of their playing careers. And I think it's a nice parallel to see the sort of the talent starting to also make decent returns, not just the agents, as the case has always been in the art industry. The dealers made huge amounts of money when the artist was dead, and almost prayed to the point when that happens, whereas many of these artists sadly died poor, and I think we are starting to see that shift. I think it's, as you said, it's a consolidating across the board from web3 all the way to the investment world, and it's exciting.
Can I also say, I think a lot of athletes have lost a lot of money and wasted a lot of money on really bad investments through funds and angel checks and so on and so forth. I think broadly speaking, most, if not 99% of those athletes would be better off giving 90% of their capital to more modest returning funds rather than kind of high risk ones. I think there's a story to be told about that in the next like 10, 15 years, because I think this is the first real wave of like athlete investing that we've seen. But in 10 to 15 years, when people start looking at the ROIs, there's going to be some stories to be told. I mean, for every Shaquille O'Neal type story who's an early investor in Google or whatever, there's also going to be 4 or 5, 20, 30 athletes who have invested in a bunch of companies that have gone wrong. I myself have been approached and asked by agents and athletes what they think of this and that. Mm-hmm. And I say, I think that's going to fail. It's not going to yield you any return. They invest anyway. I'm sure there's probably going to be loads of stories where there's lots of angel checks wasted. So I think the athlete investing side of things is really exciting, and it's a good thing that athletes are doing that, because your career only lasts so long. But I think there's going to be a story to be told there in the next 15, 20 years for sure.
I agree with you. I think it's also endemic of the startup and the scale-up world. In general, the institutional investors and the lack of data points behind the real decisions, and the fact that there's too much bias still in the investment circles. Hence, some of the great startups that get funded because they don't have networks. It's a different story, but I agree with you. But I think it comes down to also the sort of knowledge and education behind the diversified portfolios. I think you cannot put all the eggs in one basket. You can't go high risk in everything you do. As you said, you've got to go for more modest, less risky options, whoever you are, whether you're a former athlete or whether you're a small time investor or large time investors, but maybe for another time in another session. So lastly, how can others that might have listened to today's conversation contact you if they need advice, opinion, your expertise, your input, your consulting? What's the best way to sort of get hold of you?
LinkedIn is probably best these days, or you can find my email on the newsletter, sportingcrypto.substack.com. You can also find our site on sportingcrypto.com. So those are the two key places to find us.
Fantastic. Thank you, Pat. It's been a real pleasure to have you on our inaugural Block Sport podcast. Highly inspiring, insightful, energizing, and all the best, and see you very soon in London, I'm sure.
Thank you very much for having me, and we'll catch up soon, I'm sure.
Thank you. I hope you've enjoyed the premiere episode of Block Sport podcast with Berisha. Feel free to subscribe so you never miss new episodes we will release every 2 weeks. This was Samir Seric, your Block Sport podcast host. Thank you, and see you soon.